Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, I wanted to provide an update on ETH primarily because there's been a new development with the prior path that we were forecasting out for this year. Now, to get people up to speed on my general views on ETH this year, we have to understand the value of Ethereum as it relates to Bitcoin. And once we understand that, it is much easier to assess whether ETHUSD is worth the risk or not, right? So, there's a very important event that happens every market cycle in the cryptoverse. And I think it's one of the more important events that can often get overlooked, and that's the devaluation of ETH against Bitcoin, right? Against Bitcoin. And if you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, just for completeness, I will talk about it again in this video, although I'm sure many of you already know what I'm going to say. But there's this pattern that ETH carries out against Bitcoin, and we followed this pattern the entire way, right? And this is one of those things where even though people have been screaming at you for 3 years that Ethereum is holding up well against Bitcoin, they set it all the way down, right? All the way down. And before you know it, ETH has bled, 50 to 60% against Bitcoin from the top, right? 55% drop. Now, for full disclosure, I am of the opinion that ETH Bitcoin will very likely bottom out in Q4 of 2024, right? So it should bottom out this quarter, is my guess, right? I think it will bottom out this quarter. But in order to understand, sort of the path, a likely path for Ethereum for the rest of the year, we have to understand what's going on in the ETH Bitcoin valuation. There's this pattern that ETH Bitcoin has where it sets a double peak, right? But the second peak is usually a little bit lower than the first one. And we've seen it happen now 3 times. And in between these peaks, there is a low that is set. Okay, in between those 2 peaks, there's a low. And then after that second top, ETH Bitcoin then slowly bleeds back down to the range low, right? To the range low. This is something we followed really closely on this channel. And it is something that many people have faded. They faded this view, although this view was never incorrect. At least it hasn't been. And then after it breaks down, right? It broke down here in Q4 of 2016. And then in 2019, it broke down in Q3. After it breaks down, ETHUSD goes down for a while. And in 2016 and in 2019, it went down in Q4. Okay? It went down in Q4. If you were to go look at a quarterly table, right? Quarterly returns for ETH. What you'll notice is that in 2016, ETH dropped 40% in Q4, and in 2019, ETH dropped 28% in Q4. Now, right now, ETH is actually up about 2% in Q4. So the question that we must ask ourselves is, what's going to happen between now and the end of the year, right? Now, for ETH Bitcoin, the answer is probably going to be somewhat different than ETHUSD. I am of the opinion, despite the views that I'm about to present to you, I am of the opinion that it is absolutely worthwhile to hedge the view that I'm about to say. And the reason it is worthwhile to hedge is because ETH Bitcoin has finally made it to the target range that I said was the most likely scenario for it to bottom. The most likely range was between 0.03 to 0.04, right? And a lot of people doubted it, right? They doubted it. And here we are, right? 0.0397. So ETH Bitcoin is already in the target range. It could go lower into that range. One of the things that you can look at from a time-based perspective, ETH Bitcoin normally dumps about 2 to 3 months after the breaking down, right? About, it's really closer to 2 months or so. Or, it broke down, bounced, and then double bottom. And here, it's been about that long. I mean, there's still time for it to potentially go down. But what I would say is if you look at a daily time frame, one of the interesting things about ETH Bitcoin is the last 2 cycles after it reclaimed the 50-day SMA after breaking down, the low was actually in. Now, that doesn't mean that it has to be in when that happens, but that's actually what happened last time, right? And the time before that, right? After ETH Bitcoin durably broke down in 2019, once it reclaimed the 50-day SMA, it meant the low was in. In 2016, after ETH Bitcoin really durably broke below the low, once it reclaimed the 50-day SMA, it meant the low was in. It hasn't done that yet, right? It still hasn't actually done that. It's close, right? But it actually hasn't accomplished that feat. And so until that happens, you still have to be somewhat cautious, right, on getting too bold with saying the low is in, although it certainly could be. I'm of the opinion that 0.038 could be the bottom, but I think it remains wise to be open-minded, especially with ETH Bitcoin below the 50-day moving average. Most of the time when ETH Bitcoin bottoms, it gets a really strong rally off the bottom, kind of like you saw in 2019, and also like what you saw back in 2016. What's interesting so far this time is that we haven't really had that strong rally. It just keeps on sort of scraping the low, kind of like it did in 2019, right? There was a period here where, after it sort of broke down, it was sort of scraping that low for a while, and then it finally had the final drop, and then after the actual low, it then got a big rally up above the 50-day moving average. So I'm still of the opinion, watch the 50-day SMA, see if ETH Bitcoin can get above that. So far, it has been unable to do so. Remember, last cycle, ETH Bitcoin bottomed out when the Fed went from QT to QE, right? So, I mean, that's at least one caveat to consider. But the real reason that you're probably here is because of this view. And that is that in 2016 and in 2019, years that ETH Bitcoin broke down, right? ETHUSD dropped through Q4 of that year. So the normal bullish Q4 that usually happens did not actually happen for Ethereum in 2016 or 2019. And the reason, I think, is because when ETH Bitcoin breaks down, it takes the wind out of Ethereum sales, out of the sales for Ethereum, right? It takes that wind out because there's so many people that think there's absolutely no way that ETH Bitcoin could ever go back to 0.03 to 0.04, right? Even though I said that was like what was probably going to happen, they made up all these excuses as to what I thought, saying that I was calling for, all these other, cataclysmic events. But look, guys, ETH Bitcoin was at 0.02, 0.01, 0.016 in 2019. I don't really know why calling for 0.03 to 0.04 is such a bad thing. It's just the way the cycle works, right? Now those people, right? Those people are now bearish on ETH Bitcoin. After it went to the range, they said it was never going to go. But the problem for ETHUSD is it's those very people that spent the last 3 years doubting that ETH Bitcoin would drop down here. It's those people that have now turned bearish on ETH, right? It's those people. They finally turned bearish. They finally got the memo on ETH Bitcoin in likely the last quarter that the downtrend has been going on. You want to see a crazy table? Look at quarterly returns, not for ETHUSD. Look at quarterly returns for ETH Bitcoin. If you include the current quarter, ETH has been red against Bitcoin for 9 out of the last 10 quarters. And some of the gurus out there have decided now is a good time to get bearish on ETH Bitcoin after it dropped 9 of the last 10 quarters. Now, it's those people that will likely cause ETH to go down. And it's those people that could also cause ETH Bitcoin to go to a slightly lower low, right? Because they're so late to get the memo, right? They're so late to get the memo. They finally get it, but they only get it in the quarter that it's likely going to bottom out. Now, when the wind is taken out of the sails for Ethereum, what happens is in Q4 of 2016 and Q4 of 2019, ETH went down instead of up. Even though Q4 tends to be a good quarter for crypto, 2016, 2019, years that ETH Bitcoin broke down, right? ETH Bitcoin broke down there, and it broke down there, and it broke down there. And after ETH Bitcoin breaks down, ETHUSD trends down through the end of the year. That is what happened the last 2 times. Okay? And where ETH went was the lower logarithmic regression trend line, right? That's where it went. It went to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, and it bottomed out in the quarter, or in the year, in Q4 of the year that ETH Bitcoin broke down, right? If you include a pandemic-induced recession, which, let's try to ignore that for the purposes of trying to predict like reasonable outcomes, right? No one's over here saying like, let's predict the next recession-induced or the next pandemic-induced recession, right? That is what happened, right? In Q4 of the years that ETH Bitcoin broke down, ETHUSD dropped to the lower logarithmic regression trend line in Q4 of that year. So what new development has happened between this video and the last one? Because I think I said that at the beginning of the video, or if I didn't, I meant to. Why make a new video now? One of the things I said in prior videos is that before ETH goes down, it likely needs to check in with the bull market support band. That's what happened in 2019 before it went down, right? If you look in 2019, ETHUSD, after ETH Bitcoin broke down up here, ETHUSD started its downtrend, right? And then it got stuck in this range for a long time, where it basically kept going up to the 21-week EMA. I'm not really sure if the voice is still working here. My laptop's been freezing up a lot recently. I need to get a new one. But what happened in 2019 is that ETHUSD dropped in August. Sound familiar, right? That's when ETH dropped this time too, right? It dropped in August. And then it basically was range bound between the bull market support band and that, sort of that initial low. Of course, it did sweep that low some until November. And then it went down again. And then it went down again in December. You see that? And then it finally hit that lower logarithmic regression trend line and it bottomed. Yes, we did have a recession and we got a hard landing. But this would have been the soft landing for ETH, right? That would have been the soft landing in December of the year that ETH Bitcoin broke down. That would have been the soft landing. And then the pandemic changed things and we got a hard landing. But do you see that, right? Do you see what happened? ETH could not durably break down until it had been checking in with its bull market support band, right? The 21-week EMA, at the very least. 20-week SMA, 21-week EMA. Back then, it just kept getting rejected off the 21-week EMA, at least on weekly timeframes. There was like a wick above it. But the 21-week EMA provided resistance. And it also provided resistance in October, the week of October 21st, 2019. ETHUSD rallied up to the 21-week EMA. It got rejected the week of October 21st. It is the week of October 21st, my friends. And what's fascinating is that, once again, ETHUSD was rejected off of its 21-week moving average. So when you look at this, it looks kind of familiar, right? It looks kind of like what happened over here in 2019, where there's a capitulation in August, right? And then it just kind of stays in this range and then perhaps doesn't really break down until November. Why November? Well, November will be when we get the next labor market report. And there's going to be a lot of things going on in November. I also think that, you have the dollar rallying, you have the long end of the yield curve rallying. If that extends into November and December, that could take the wind out of the sails for Ethereum. The last 2 years, the long end of the yield curve topped in October. So if the long end continues to go up beyond October, that might be some, cause for concern for assets like Ethereum. But the reality, right? The reality is that ETH in 2019, a year where ETH Bitcoin broke down, was doing the exact same thing it's doing this year, right? Getting stuck in this range. And then for whatever reason, in November and December, it actually went down instead of up, despite everyone being bullish on it back then and calling for, a major rally. It actually went down in Q4. And I think the reason it's going down is not because of the people watching this channel, right? Because if you've been watching this channel, you've known about the ETH Bitcoin trend for a long time, right? You knew long ago that Bitcoin dominance was going to go up for years. You knew long ago that Bitcoin was going to outperform Ethereum. So you probably had a Bitcoin heavy crypto portfolio instead of knee deep in ETH watching it bleed back to Bitcoin. But now that we see the other view, right? Now that 2025 is quickly approaching and we can envision a world where Ethereum starts to outperform Bitcoin, and it seems like it could go the other way. Unfortunately, the people that faded the ETH Bitcoin drop for the last 3 years are now just getting the memo, and they could be the reason why ETHUSD goes to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, right? So if this happens, you have to be prepared for it. It could be the people that capitulate ETH this late into the game, again, are the very people that said it would never happen. Because those are the people that said it would never go to 0.03 to 0.04, which is exactly where it is. Remember, in 2019, ETH Bitcoin bottomed before ETHUSD. ETH Bitcoin bottomed in September. Coincidentally, the low for ETH Bitcoin right now is September of 2024. It could go a little bit lower, but I don't think it's going to go that much lower. You know, I really don't. I mean, a little bit maybe, but it doesn't have to. I could easily see it finding a bottom relatively soon, bouncing, and then going up in 2025. But despite the fact that ETH Bitcoin bottomed in September of 2019, ETHUSD kept going down, right? So ETH Bitcoin bottomed here. But then ETHUSD kept going down because Bitcoin took it down. But this is the pattern that we have to understand that this is what happened. And by the way, if you don't like the 2019 comparison because of the halving year and all that, I got good news for you. Great news. There's another year that we can look at as well that is not a pre-halving year, right? The reason I compare 2024 to 2019 is because if you look at the rate hiking cycle, right? If you just look at interest rates, this, like, you know, where the Fed started to cut, that was when ETHUSD went to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, right? It went home when the Fed started to cut. And now the same thing is happening again, right? The Fed is starting to cut. And as it does, ETHUSD is trending down, potentially through Q4. Do you see the similarities? That's why I make the comparison to 2019, right? I don't need 100 of you to go to the comment section and ask me why I'm comparing it to 2019 again. Like, I get it. You don't believe it. You don't want to compare it to 2019. But if you had compared it to 2019 back in March, you would have been on the right side of this move, okay? So I don't really understand the dilemma. I don't really understand the difficulty with comparing it to 2019. You can see that monetary policy is very similar, right? It's doing a very similar qualitative thing, even though the quantitative aspect might be different. Qualitatively, it's doing the same thing. Therefore, Ethereum, following it in 2019 has been useful for following it in 2024. Even if you don't want to admit that it made sense, it's been following it. But if you still don't care, right? If you're still like, you know what? I see what he's saying, right? But I still don't buy it, right? I'm not buying that view, right? If you're more of the cyclical view of crypto, then I've got great news, right? In 2016, a halving year where the Fed actually had rates constant for a while and then started to increase them, ETHUSD also went down in Q4, a year that ETH Bitcoin broke down. You see? And in fact, I have said all year, I don't think this is exactly 2019, but I also don't think it's 2016 either exactly. I think it's a combination of both of them because both people have a point. Monetary policy is extremely important, right? No one's going to deny that. It's extremely important. Right? We can't say that it's not. If you actually look at the ROI from the low for Bitcoin, we can say this time is different all we want, but look, I mean, it's basically exactly where it was the last two cycles at this point. So no one's denying the cyclical component of Bitcoin, right? I'm just over here saying, look, monetary policy has also played a role. Because if you look at something like year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins, and you look at prior halving years, you can understand why some people came into this year bearish on Bitcoin dominance. They were wrong, and I told them they were going to be wrong, but you can understand why. They were probably looking at prior halving years and saying that Bitcoin dominance went down. But what they failed to understand is that in 2024, it was going to go up, because the Fed had to keep rates higher for longer, right? And that's what's happened, right? So monetary policy is important. The cyclical view of crypto is important. So if you do think that it makes no sense to compare to 2019, fine, compare to 2016. What's interesting is if you look at monthly candles for 2016 and 2024, with the exception of the current month, which still isn't over yet, every red candle in 2016 has been red in 2024. Every green candle in 2016 has been green in 2024, right? So January, February, March were green in 2016, just like they were in 2024. And then April was red in 2016. April was red in 2024. And then May was green. May was green. And then June, July, August were red. Same thing in 2024. June, July, August were red. September was green, just like this September has been green. Or sorry, yeah, this past September was green. Then October through December was red, right? October through December was red in 2016. Right now, October's green, right? But we still have a little over a week to go, and it's only up 2.5%. But it's not exactly 2016, as I have said. It's actually a weaker version of 2016. If you look at 2016, what you'll notice is that ETH had 3 capitulations, right? There were 3 months where ETHUSD had a big drop to a lower low. April, August, December. April, August, December. I was just saying it in my head like all year long. April, right? April right here. August, December. Those were the 3 capitulations in ETH in 2016 that took ETH home. April, August, December. Look at this year, right? 3 capitulations. We've already had 2 of them. The first one was in April. The second one was in August. The third one, if you connect the dots, December, where it takes ETH to the lower logarithmic regression trend line. You see that? So October might not be red for ETH in 2024. It could be, but if it's green, you know what it really is starting to look like right now to me? 2019. Again, some parts of the year look more like 2016, other parts look like 2019. Another part that looks like 2019 is the fact that, you basically had this top form right around the same time that gold broke out and USDT dominance hit its trend line, right? That's exactly when the top formed over here as well. But look at this. Look at 2019 for ETHUSD. These are monthly candles. You see how ETHUSD dropped, and then September, October were green with wicks to the 21-week EMA. You see it right here. Same thing, right? We dropped down September, October, going up with wicks to the 21-week EMA. But then once November arrived and December, ETH finally went down, right? So I still look at that and I think that, that is the most likely outcome. But as I said earlier in the video, it would be foolish to bet everything on that view, right? And I think that because ETH Bitcoin is between 0.03 to 0.04, it does make sense to start hedging this view, right? I haven't really, I personally haven't really been on the view or I haven't really had the view that it makes sense for me to hedge much until 0.03 to 0.04 is achieved. Now it has been achieved. And I could see a scenario where, I could be wrong about it going home in Q4. Maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe it doesn't actually happen. But what I think the reason it is more likely to happen than not is because I think that I really started to notice this on Twitter. A lot of the people, again, that have been bullish on ETH Bitcoin, that were very bullish on it at 0.08, are now turning bearish on it. And I'm like, are you guys kidding me? Right? You gave me such a hard time for so many years about me calling for 0.03 to 0.04, and now that it's actually happening, now you're gonna go sell your ETH. That's could be the reason why ETH goes home, right? Because the people that don't believe that ETH Bitcoin could ever break down that far, when it does, ETHUSD then stays weak through Q4. But again, good luck convincing those people of that. I couldn't convince them they should be bearish on ETH Bitcoin at 0.08, and I'm probably going to have no luck convincing them that they might want to be bullish on it starting in the 0.03 to 0.04 range, which is where we are now. Okay, so look, I think that, if we're just looking at the market and how it works and sort of the emotional aspect of it and what people generally think is going to happen, I think that you got a lot of people dunking on ETH. which probably means it's going to bottom out against Bitcoin this quarter. But because those people are finally looking at ETH Bitcoin and they're looking at it at 0.03 to 0.04, they're probably getting really bearish on it. That could be the reason ETHUSD finally goes to lower logarithmic regression trend line in Q4 of 2024, just like ETHUSD went home in Q4 of 2016, Q4 of 2019, and now Q4 of 2024, years that ETH Bitcoin broke down. If this happens, right, you can't ever tell me that it's not worthwhile to follow Bitcoin dominance, right? I mean, because this has been a long time in the making. And you could have a situation where ETHUSD goes down here on a Bitcoin rally or a Bitcoin dump. Okay, I don't want to sound crazy, but in 2016, when ETHUSD went down, it went down on a Bitcoin rally. In 2019, when ETHUSD went down, it went down on a Bitcoin dump. I tend to think they're more correlated now than in 2016, but there's also no denying the fact that there is still some divergence, right? This month, Bitcoin is up 6%, while ETH is only up, 2.6%, right? So ETH is still lagging Bitcoin to a large degree. But, if you look at this type of stuff, right? If you look at this type of stuff, this type of analysis, and say, well, look, ETH Bitcoin has been a pretty good harbinger of where ETHUSD is going to go that year. And I'm not saying it makes sense to get bearish on it, right? I mean, the time to get bearish on it was up here at 4K when ETH Bitcoin broke down. But if ETHUSD falls below this, then that's what eventually takes it home. Now, again, in the short term, there's no denying, right, that it's at a pretty important trend line. And this is what I think is going to matter here. There's this trend line that ETHUSD has been holding for a while, right? I think there's a good chance that it will break down below it in Q4, right? This quarter, come down here and then potentially bounce in 2025. But we'll see what happens. In 2019, ETHUSD, as it came up to the 21-week EMA, it hit it several times for several weeks in a row, and then it didn't really drop until November. So you could have something like that happen again here, where it refuses to really go down until we get out into, say, mid-November, which is really not that far away. It's only like 3 weeks from now. But in 2016, the week that Ethereum just had that was green right here. In 2016, it was also green this week. But then it just continued this downtrend following that. So I still do think it makes sense to be cautious on ETHUSD. ETH Bitcoin is probably in the process of bottoming out, is what I would guess, right? But if you look over here in 2019, ETHUSD basically came back down to just above that higher low, right? So this higher low right here, if you go just above it, would put Ethereum right around $1,200, which I know sounds crazy, but it already went to 1,900, right? I mean, this is not, if you told people at 4K that ETH could go to $1,200, they wouldn't have believed it. Then you tell them at 3K it could go to 1,200, they still don't believe it. Then you tell them at 2K, and it's just like, well, guys, I mean, like, it already went to 1,900. Why can't it go to 1,200? It doesn't have to, right? I could be wrong, which is why I think it makes sense to absolutely hedge. But if you look at 2016, ETHUSD dropped 70% from that high, the high where ETH Bitcoin broke down. If you look at 2019, ETHUSD dropped about 70%. And if you take it from 2024, a 70% drop would put Ethereum at around $1,200. Does it have to happen? No, right? Will the critics have a field day with the analysis? Yes. Have they been bullish on ETH Bitcoin for the last 3 years? Absolutely, right? Absolutely. Most of them have been. And most of them would have been better off holding Bitcoin, but they laughed at Bitcoin dominance. And now they did not preserve the Satoshi valuation of their portfolio because they held Ethereum for the last 3 years instead of Bitcoin. If you held Bitcoin for the last 3 years in preparation for a Bitcoin dominance rally, you've now outperformed a majority of the altcoin market, including Ethereum. Now, how does ETH go down here, right? I mean, is it on a Bitcoin rally or is it a Bitcoin dump? I'll tell you guys, I really can't say for sure because I honestly think that predicting USD valuations of Bitcoin are incredibly difficult. I would say this. I would say that if it follows the cyclical view of Bitcoin, it's more likely that Bitcoin breaks out because if you look at like year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in halving years, Bitcoin goes up in Q4. And so far, it's following suit, right? But the reason you can't take that to the bank, right? The reason you can't take that to the bank is there's also unfortunately, the monetary policy view. And the monetary policy view says, hold on a second, after the Fed cut rates last cycle, the Fed cut rates right here, right after the first rate cut, Bitcoin rallied up to a lower high. Here, we had the first rate cut here. Following that first rate cut, Bitcoin has rallied up still to a lower high. And then following that lower high, Bitcoin then dropped to the 100-week moving average, right? So if Bitcoin does drop to the 100-week moving average, right, then you can, and by the way, it would kind of follow through this trend line right here by November, December. Remember we said mid-November? That 100-week moving average is going to cross through here in Q4. And you can see right over here, it crossed through. See how Bitcoin fell to the 100-week moving average in 2019? After the first rate cut, rate cut, rallied to a lower high, dropped to the 100-week moving average. If Bitcoin, I think we can agree to this, right? I think this is something that everyone would agree to. I'm not saying it has to happen, but if, it's an if-then statement, get off my back, right? If Bitcoin is unable to break out and it falls to the 100-week moving average, I don't think anyone would debate ETHUSD going home, right? I don't think you could realistically debate that, right? Like if Bitcoin drops to 40K or, the low 40s, how does Ethereum not go to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, right? Is there a world where Bitcoin drops and ETH goes up in Q4? Probably not, right? So if Bitcoin gets rejected and goes down, then certainly that would be enough to take ETHUSD to tag this trend line once again, right? April, August, December, just like 2016, right? April, August, December. So if Bitcoin gets rejected off the lower high structure after the first rate cut, like 2019, and it goes to the lower part of the channel again, certainly that would take ETH home. If Bitcoin breaks out, could ETH still go down? That's what 2016 says is possible, but I have a hard time believing it, honestly. But I'll tell you one way that it could happen, right? I have a hard time believing it, but if in 2016 you see, the thing about 2016 that makes me less likely is to sort of really believe it is like the structure in 2016, right? The April drop by Ethereum was sort of a low for Bitcoin, but then the August drop for Ethereum was a higher low for Bitcoin. But in 2024, the lows for Bitcoin are lower lows, not higher lows, right? And so then the December drop, right? The December drop for Ethereum was still a higher level for Bitcoin. In 2019, the lows for Ethereum were lower lows for Bitcoin, more like 2024. So if Bitcoin is rejected from the lower high structure following the first rate cut like 2019, well, then surely it would take ETH home, right? I mean, how could it not? If Bitcoin rallies through, is there a scenario where ETH still goes down? Honestly, it's hard to imagine. But the only scenario I could think of is that in 2016, when Bitcoin rallied, it also happened to correspond to a rally by the dollar, right? To a rally by the dollar. If you go look at 2016, the dollar rallied in Q4, right? And it topped out at the end of the year, early the following year, right? But it rallied in Q4. And Bitcoin went up and ETH went down. And I said following the first rate cut, we'll likely see the dollar rally. And guess what? The dollar is rallying, right? So the dollar is rallying here. And the problem for things like altcoins, for like ETH, are that they struggle a lot more with dollar rallies than Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is able to sort of face it a little bit more head on than the altcoin market. So you could argue that, if Bitcoin really is a harder asset, right? Which I mean, look, it's been the safer asset in the Cryptoverse for the last 3 years. It's more likely to go up than the altcoin market. Put it this way. There's not really a universe that I can think of where the altcoin market goes up in Q4, but Bitcoin goes down. But there does exist a scenario where Bitcoin could go up in Q4, but the altcoin market could go down. The way it could happen is if Bitcoin goes up, and then it gets to drop later on in Q4 to a higher low, altcoins go to a lower low. But it's just hard to imagine the reverse happening, at least not until 2025, right? In 2025, you might see the market dynamics change after we have rate cuts under our belt, more rate cuts. But at this point, with the dollar rallying and with the long end of the yield curve rallying, which is what I also said was going to happen, right? If you look at the 10-year yield, it's up another 2.33% today, right? I mean, look, it could keep on climbing here for a little bit longer. So, is there a chance that Bitcoin breaks out and ETH goes down? It's possible. And it could also send Bitcoin dominance to 60%, right? Whether Bitcoin gets rejected or goes up and then comes back down, I just think that ETH is likely going to take a hit. And we'll see, we'll see what the narrative is behind it. I would say this, if ETH can get above its bull market support band, then I might have to flip my view and say, all right, well, this is why it makes sense to hedge ETH Bitcoin at below 0.04, because there's no way to know, right? There's no way to know. But what I do know is that in 2016 and 2019 and 2024, ETH Bitcoin broke down. And the last 2 times it did it, ETHUSD went down in Q4. And it didn't bottom until December. And then it went up the following year after that looser monetary policy, especially in 2020, really took hold. And you're probably going to see something. I mean, we've already been getting rate cut. We've already got 1 rate cut. We'll probably get a couple more before the end of the year. So those are my views on Ethereum. The reason I'm providing this video update is because it finally tagged its 21-week EMA after being unable to really tag it since July, right? Late July, early August. Finally, ETHUSD got back up to it in October. Same thing happened over here. If you look, there's a period, August capitulation, and then kind of just trending below the bull market support band. Finally dropped November, December. Same thing, 2016. Some strength in October, but then November, December, it dropped down. I think we're likely going to see the same thing happen again. And as that happens, it could eventually coincide with Bitcoin dominance hitting 60% before the end of the year, ETH Bitcoin bottoming in Q4, and then theoretically that looser monetary policy coming to the aid of Ethereum by early 2025. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.